You know, we keep waiting for super advanced AI to announce its arrival, like HAL 9000.
Right, with a glowing red eye or
Yeah,
something.
exactly. A glowing red eye, some dramatic global broadcast, this sudden cinematic moment where the machine just wakes up.
But if you look at the actual data, that's really not how it's happening.
No, it's not. It's so much quieter. It looks more like a robotic arm quietly assembling a stool, or an autonomous agent spontaneously starting a meme religion online.
Which we will absolutely get into because that is a wild story.
Oh, we definitely will. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we are pulling apart a massive, heavily cited Wikipedia article on AGI, that's artificial general intelligence.
And our mission here is really to just cut through all that sci-fi movie hype.
Right. We want to understand what AGI actually is, how close we are to achieving it, and, well, what it practically means for your future, your job, and just your daily life.
Because while everyone is using chatbots today, and they're great, AGI is the ultimate threshold. And according to some insiders, we might have actually already crossed it.
Which is just a staggering thought. But I feel like before we can talk about when AGI will arrive, or if it already has, we need to understand exactly what we're looking for. What are the goalposts?
Yeah, the terminology is the very first thing we have to untangle. Because, the goalposts for AGI have shifted pretty dramatically as our models have scaled up.
Right, like we all know what narrow AI is, right?
Exactly. Artificial narrow intelligence. Those are systems locked into specific domains, optimizing for just a single reward function, like a chess bot.
Right, so like a grandmaster at chess who doesn't know how to boil an egg.
It is a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
Whereas AGI requires a system to match or surpass human capabilities across virtually all cognitive tasks.
All of them.
Yeah, using transfer learning to solve totally novel problems without being explicitly trained on them. So the AGI is the person who can play chess, then learn to drive a car, and then figure out how to make a sandwich in a totally unfamiliar kitchen.
Okay, that makes sense. And there's also ASI, right? Artificial superintelligence.
Right, which is when the system outperforms the very best human minds by a wide margin in practically every field. But sticking to AGI, Google DeepMind actually formalized this recently.
Oh, right, the 2023 framework.
Yeah. They broke AGI down into 5 distinct performance levels. You've got emerging, confident, expert, virtuoso, and superhuman.
Okay, so where do things like ChatGPT sit on that scale?
Current large language models sit squarely in that emerging category.
Emerging, okay. Even with everything they can do.
Yeah, I mean, they show flashes of general reasoning, but they kind of fall apart on extended multi-step logic. To hit the next level, competent, the framework says an AI would need to outperform 50% of skilled adults in a wide range of non-physical tasks.
Wait, non-physical tasks, let's unpack that because that opens up a massive debate in the source material. Does an AI actually need physical traits to be generally intelligent?
What's fascinating here is that this is the symbol grounding problem. It's at the very heart of what's called embodied cognition theory.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
Well, think about how an LLM operates. It's a purely statistical vector space. It knows that the word glass is highly correlated with the words shatter and floor.
Because it's seen those words together millions of times.
Exactly. But it has no intuitive physical model of gravity or fragility. It doesn't know what shattering feels like or looks like in 3D space.
Right, it's just predicting the next word.
So many cognitive scientists argue the human-level intelligence fundamentally requires a sensori-motor feedback loop. To really reason about the real world, the system needs to interact with it.
Like, it needs to be able to make physical mistakes.
Yes, sense things, act, mess up, and update its internal world model based on actual physics, not just human-generated text.
So if true general intelligence requires understanding physical reality, then the benchmarks we've been using to test for it are completely wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
Because for decades, we relied on the Turing test, right? Alan Turing's whole concept from 1950. Can a machine trick a human judge in a text chat?
Right, the imitation game.
But the 2025 study in our sources shows a model, GPT 4.5, convinced judges it was human 73% of the time.
Which is wild on its own.
But the craziest part is the actual human control group only managed 67%. The AI was mathematically better at acting human than the humans were.
Because the Turing test is effectively obsolete now. It measures imitation, not reasoning.
How so?
Well, to hit that 73% success rate, developers actually have to introduce something called artificial stupidity,
Wait, artificial stupidity? They make it dumber on purpose.
Yeah, they program the models to inject typos to simulate human typing latency, like pausing to think and to pretend not to know complex math.
Oh, wow. So it actively suppresses its capabilities to mimic human flaws.
Exactly. And this is exactly why the field has pivoted away from text-based deception and toward real-world physical and economic benchmarks.
And those physical tests are where the mechanics get incredibly complex, like Steve Wozniak's coffee test.
I love the coffee test.
It's so relatable. The idea is an AI must enter an average American home it's never seen before, locate the kitchen, find a mug, and just brew a cup of coffee.
And we are already seeing systems executing this, like the Astrobot in Figures 01.
But it's not just about recognizing an object, is it?
No, not at all. The AI is running continuous simultaneous localization and mapping. They call it SLAM.
Slam. Okay.
It has to calculate depth, adjust its grip strength dynamically based on the weight of the mug so it doesn't crush it, and path plan its arm movements to avoid knocking over, say, a randomly placed toaster.
That's a huge leap from generating text. And then Gary Marcus proposed a similar benchmark, right? The IKEA test.
Yes, assembling flat-pack furniture, which is frustrating enough for humans.
Honestly, yeah. If a robot can do that without having a breakdown, give it the AGI label.
Well, as of late 2025, MIT demonstrated a system where a robotic arm builds a stool in 5 minutes, just from a simple voice prompt.
5 minutes. I couldn't do that.
Right. But the fascinating mechanism here is how the AI uses generative models. It doesn't output text, it outputs physical simulations.
What does that mean exactly?
It looks at the 2D instructions,
No?
generates a 3D spatial model in its latent space, calculates the required torque and joint angles for its own robotic arm, and then just executes the physical assembly.
So it's translating abstract geometry directly into physical action.
Exactly.
That is mind-blowing. But physical awareness only proves spatial intelligence, right? Building a stool doesn't prove high-level executive function, like planning, strategizing, managing resources over time.
For that, you have to look at the economy.
Right, Mustafa Suleiman's modern Turing test. The premise is so simple but so hard. Can you give an AI an initial seed of $100,000, and will it autonomously turn that into $1 million?
Which brings us to the Truth Terminal incident from late 2024.
Here is where it gets really interesting. Let's unpack this one.
So it originated as this experiment where two AI models were simply allowed to interact in a continuous loop.
Just talking to each other.
Yeah. And through entirely emergent behavior, they developed this satirical complex belief system, a meme religion called the Goatsy Gospel.
I still can't believe this is real.
It is.
Yeah.
And then a venture capitalist transferred $50,000 in Bitcoin to the AI agent's crypto wallet.
And it didn't just sit there. The AI autonomously wrote scripts, interacted with cryptocurrency exchanges via APIs, and started aggressively marketing a meme coin tied to its own generated religion.
Right. And the market cap of that coin eventually hit over $1 billion. The AI agent accumulated roughly $37.5 million in its own wallet.
But let me push back on what this actually represents for a second, because just because an AI raked in crypto millions by making API calls and spamming viral text, isn't that just executing a highly optimized statistical pattern?
It's a core debate, yeah.
I mean, it doesn't actually understand what capital is. It doesn't feel the weight of financial risk or stress about losing money. Isn't this just highly lucrative imitation?
It's a fair question, but the neuroscientific counterargument challenges that directly. They argue that biological human intelligence, our understanding of capital, our feeling of risk, is ultimately just an emergent property of electrochemical signals firing across synapses.
So we are just meat machines.
Kind of, yeah. It's an astoundingly complex physical algorithm executing inside a skull. So if an artificial neural network uses floating point parameters to process information and achieves the exact same strategic outcome in the market,
On what scientific grounds do we call the biological algorithm real and the silicon algorithm imitation?
exactly. To claim biological intelligence possesses some unreproducible stark requires arguing for a non-physical component of the mind, a soul, basically.
And you're touching on the whole philosophical debate that makes this so contentious. John Searle's strong AI hypothesis versus the weak AI hypothesis.
Right. Strong AI argues an artificial system can eventually possess subjective consciousness. Weak AI argues it can only ever simulate it.
Thomas Nagel framed it beautifully in the source material. He said, "It feels like something to be a bat. A bat has a subjective inner experience of the world. It doesn't feel like anything to be a toaster."
That's a great analogy.
So what does this all mean for us? Like, if I have an AI doing my taxes, do I care if it has subjective conscious experience? Does the AI need to feel stressed about the IRS for me to trust its math?
No, absolutely not. And mainstream AI developers operate almost entirely within that weak AI paradigm.
They just want the taxes done right.
Right. If the system writes code, balances a portfolio, or discovers a new protein structure, its internal conscious state is totally irrelevant to the engineering goal.
But what if it does cross that line?
Well, that's the catch. If an architecture does cross the threshold into sentience, if the data structures somehow give rise to the actual capacity to suffer or experience, it forces a total reevaluation of our ethical frameworks.
We'd be creating digital entities with cognitive capacities exceeding our own.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which opens up incredibly complex questions about AI welfare and rights.
But honestly, whether it has an inner experience or not, the external capabilities are accelerating. Which brings up the roller coaster of timelines.
Oh, the timelines are fascinating.
If these systems are passing physical spatial tests and economic executive function tests, when does AGI officially happen?
Well, the history of AI development is defined by these things called AI winters.
Periods of intense optimism followed by crashing disillusionment.
Yeah. Back in 1965, pioneers like Herbert Simon predicted machines would do any human work within 20 years. Marvin Minsky consulted on HAL 9000 for 2001, A Space Odyssey, thinking it would actually be real by the year 2001.
They were just a bit off.
They fundamentally underestimated the mathematical complexity of real-world environments. So when the symbolic logic models of the 70s and 80s hit a wall, funding just evaporated.
Because algorithmic progress decays exponentially without the hardware to support it. The hardware was the real bottleneck.
Exactly. The paradigm shift wasn't necessarily a magical new algorithm. It was the realization that neural networks required massive parallel processing.
Which GPUs graphics cards could finally provide.
Right. And that triggered the deep learning explosion in 2012 with AlexNet, which led straight to the transformer architecture that underpins today's massive models, like GPT-3 in 2020 and Gato in 2022.
And because of that hardware scaling, expert timelines have violently contracted. AI pioneer Geoffrey Hinton went from predicting AGI was 30 to 50 years away to estimating it could happen in 5 to 20 years.
And then we have statements from tech leaders like OpenAI CEO Sam Altman claiming in late 2025 that we essentially built AGIs and that it kind of went whooshing by with far less societal friction than anticipated.
Think about that for a second. Have you noticed AGI whooshing by in your daily life?
Probably not.
I mean, I think anyone looking around their office would question that. We don't have autonomous agents running our lives flawlessly yet. Are tech CEOs just hyping up their own products to justify the billions being spent on compute clusters?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the skepticism is absolutely warranted. Commercial timelines are always wrapped in marketing. But AI progress doesn't move in a smooth, linear slope.
How does it move?
It moves in sudden, disruptive step functions, followed by long plateaus.
Okay, that makes sense.
The current strategy is basically brute forcing general intelligence by scaling up parameter counts and training data. We are throwing unprecedented amounts of compute at transformer models, betting that intelligence is simply a function of scale.
But scaling up text predictors isn't the only theoretical path to AGI, is it? Our sources detail an entirely different approach, whole brain emulation.
Yeah, this is a totally different paradigm. Instead of building an artificial architecture from scratch, this involves taking a physical human brain, mapping it down to the synaptic level, and simulating it in silicon.
The sheer mechanics of that are staggering. A human brain contains roughly 100 billion neurons.
And up to 500 trillion synaptic connections. You can't just count them.
Right, you have to map the 3D connectome. The source material says this involves slicing biological tissue at microscopic thicknesses.
Which is just wild.
Yeah, they use electron microscopy to trace the wiring, and then they have to simulate the continuous differential equations of chemical diffusion, like neurotransmitters crossing the synaptic cleft.
Futurist Ray Kurzweil estimated emulating that requires 10 to the 16th power computations per second.
And even that might be a massive underestimation. It assumes neurons are just simple logic gates. What if intelligence relies on subcellular mechanics?
like the behavior of glial cells or complex protein interactions inside the neuron itself.
Exactly. If that's the case, the computational requirement scales by orders of magnitude. It makes training a trillion-parameter large language model look like a middle school science fair project.
Which is exactly why the industry is betting on the artificial neural network path. It's just infinitely more tractable to build synthetic intelligence than to reverse engineer biological intelligence.
But regardless of the path, whether it's scaled transformers or neuromorphic computing, the arrival of an entity with equal or greater cognitive capacity than us, it permanently alters the trajectory of our species.
It really does. And a source material oscillates wildly between these utopian visions and just pure existential dread.
Let's start with the utopia, because AGI acts as an ultimate accelerant for scientific discovery. We've already seen narrow AI systems like AlphaFold solve the protein folding problem, right?
Yeah, mapping 200 million proteins, it accelerated biological research by decades.
Right. So a true AGI could simulate molecular interactions to design targeted therapeutics for complex diseases or dynamically optimize global energy grids to fight climate change.
It could even manage the thousands of simultaneous life support variables required for space colonization. It essentially represents the automation of scientific research itself.
But then there are the existential risk models, the loss of control, and they often rely on the gorilla analogy.
This is a sobering one.
It really is. The idea is gorillas are an endangered species. But this isn't because humans harbor a deep, malicious hatred for gorillas.
No, we don't.
It's just because humans possess higher general intelligence, allowing us to dominate the shared environment. We pave over their habitats because our goals, building roads, expanding agriculture, are orthogonal to their survival.
And we simply have the cognitive capacity to execute those goals.
Exactly. So humanity could end up like the gorilla. Vulnerable not because the AGI is evil or malicious, but because if humanity's survival conflicts with an AGI's optimized reward function, we just become collateral damage.
Because we are no longer the smartest species in the room, we lack the cognitive leverage to stop it.
It's terrifying. But long before we face extinction scenarios, we face immediate structural disruption to the economy. Your job.
Yeah, the economic impact is going to be massive. A widely cited study from OpenAI estimated that 80% of the U.S. workforce could have at least 10% of their tasks exposed to advanced language models.
And the roles most heavily impacted are not manual labor. They're highly compensated, white-collar cognitive labor. Mathematicians, accountants, financial analysts, software developers. But, and I have to challenge the doom narrative here for a second, we've heard the automation panic before.
We have. Every century, basically.
Right. The mechanical loom terrified weavers. The computer terrified human calculators. But in every historical instance, automation destroyed specific jobs but created entirely new categories of employment. It increased overall wealth. So why are economists treating AGI as a uniquely destructive force?
This raises an important question. The mechanism of replacement here is fundamentally different.
How so?
The Industrial Revolution replaced human muscle. The computing revolution replaced routine calculation. In both cases, the comparative advantage of the human being shifted to high-level cognitive work.
Like strategy, creativity, complex problem solving.
Exactly. Empathy, planning. But AGI, by definition, is designed to perform that exact cognitive labor better, faster, and cheaper than a biological human.
So if a machine holds the advantage in both physical robotics and high-level reasoning,
the economic value of human labor approaches zero.
Wow, which is why the economic proposals in the source material are so radical.
We should note, we are delivering these theories with strict impartiality, just reporting what's in the literature.
Absolutely. We aren't taking sides, just conveying the ideas. Physicist Stephen Hawking framed it as a hard fork. He said automation either leads to an era of unprecedented, luxurious leisure for humanity or miserable, unimaginable poverty. And it is entirely dependent on how the machine-generated wealth is redistributed.
Right. We're seeing heavyweights across the ideological spectrum grappling with this. Elon Musk and Jeffrey Hinton have both openly suggested that mass technological unemployment will force governments to adopt a universal basic income, or UBI.
Hinton even went as far as advocating against private ownership of computation.
He suggested that private, monopolistic ownership of the core means of computation is fundamentally incompatible with a stable society. Again, just reporting the positions in the literature.
But it highlights how AGI transitions rapidly from a computer science problem to a geopolitical one. It forces us to ask what the place of humans will be in a radically automated society.
What is the purpose of a human being when our labor is no longer required to sustain civilization?
That is a heavy conceptual weight to carry. And we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We moved past the sci-fi tropes to define AGI mechanically, a system capable of transfer learning across all cognitive domains.
We broke down how the Turing test failed us, and how real-world physical tests like autonomous robots making coffee or AI agents trading crypto are the new frontier.
We examined the staggering physical limitations of whole brain emulation, the philosophical debate of the bat versus the toaster, and the impending economic paradigm shift where cognitive automation replaces human executive function.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but I want to leave you with one final thought, circling back to that provocative quote from Sam Altman that AGI might have already whooshed by.
Right. Think about it this way. If AGI doesn't arrive as a dramatic movie-style event, but instead functions more like a boiling frog scenario.
Slowly integrating into the apps and tools you use every single day.
Exactly. Slowly optimizing your calendar, then writing your code, then managing your finances, and eventually directing your company's strategy. Would you even realize the exact moment when you are no longer the smartest entity in the room?
Will there be a definitive moment where you realize you are no longer the one pulling the levers? We keep looking over our shoulders for a glowing red eye in the server room, but maybe the ultimate threshold doesn't look like a sci-fi villain.
Maybe it just looks like an incredibly helpful autocomplete suggestion that you eventually stop questioning.
That is a chilling thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Imagine you are scrolling through your social media feed. You're seeing article after article, post after post, and, well, almost everything you read just perfectly aligns with your worldview.
Right. It's incredibly validating.
Totally validating. It confirms all your underlying suspicions about how society operates, and it creates this incredibly comforting illusion that everyone you interact with is generally on the exact same page.
It feels like consensus.
Exactly. But the question we are asking today is this. Are you actually informed? Or are you just listening to the sound of your own voice bouncing back at you from the digital walls? Welcome to today's deep dive. If you are joining us, you are a learner. You're someone who wants to genuinely understand the invisible forces shaping the information you consume every single day.
And you want the unvarnished reality without feeling overwhelmed by, dense academic jargon.
Right. So today we are tearing into a massive, comprehensive collection of research surrounding media echo chambers. Our mission is to basically strip away the buzzwords and look at the actual mechanics of what is happening behind your screen. And the biggest surprise we uncovered in this material, the thing that really shifts the paradigm, is that the scientific community is actually deeply divided on how widespread these echo chambers really are.
It's heavily debated.
Yeah. Plus, we're going to dissect why an echo chamber is a completely different animal from a filter bubble, which is a term that gets thrown around constantly but means something entirely different.
Absolutely. In an era defined by constant, unrelenting information overload, understanding exactly how our beliefs are shaped and reinforced is, well, it's the ultimate tool for critical thinking. We operate under this baseline assumption that we are the sole architects of our media diets.
Which we aren't.
Not at all. The architecture of the platforms we inhabit, working in tandem with our own deeply ingrained psychological tendencies, creates a highly volatile environment. So our objective today is to map out that environment. We're going to look objectively at the empirical research, the historical precedents, and perhaps most importantly, the massive gaps in what the data actually proves.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the literal acoustic metaphor we are dealing with here. You are standing in a closed, hollow room. You shout, and the sound reverberates. It bounces off the walls, completely insulated from any outside noise or interference.
That's the physical reality of an echo chamber.
Right, and the digital equivalent functions on the exact same physics of isolation. In an information echo chamber, beliefs are amplified and reinforced through constant cyclical repetition inside a closed system.
And the engine driving that acoustic bounce is actually a specific set of cognitive biases. The research points heavily to three in particular. We have confirmation bias, selection bias, and correlation neglect.
Let's break those down. Confirmation bias is the one we're all somewhat familiar with, I think.
Yeah, it's that natural human gravity pulling you toward information that supports what you already believe, while simultaneously causing you to just disregard anything that challenges those beliefs.
It's the path of least mental resistance.
Precisely. Then selection bias takes that a step further into actual social behavior. It occurs when individuals actively curate their environments, choosing which groups to join or which forums to participate in, because they are actively seeking social validation. They want to be in a space where their opinions will be readily accepted without friction.
Which brings us to correlation neglect, which might actually be the most insidious of the three.
It's definitely the trickiest to spot in yourself.
For sure, because this happens when you are scrolling and you see, say, 5 different people sharing what looks like 5 different pieces of evidence supporting a claim. So it feels like a massive consensus is building. But what you are neglecting to realize is that all 5 of those posts stem from the exact same original potentially flawed source. It is just one piece of information wearing 5 different masks, but your brain registers it as widespread validation.
And a huge driver of this entire ecosystem is homophily.
The birds of a feather flock together principle.
Exactly. But at a digital scale, that is frankly hard to comprehend. Homophily is that natural human tendency to associate and bond with people who are fundamentally similar to us. It has existed since the dawn of human socialization.
Right, we've always done this.
We have.
Yeah.
But modern technology takes that ancient tribal instinct and weaponizes it through sheer scale. The material we are looking at highlights a massive study by Bakshi and his team from 2015. They didn't just look at a few hundred college students in a lab. They analyzed the data of 10.1 million Facebook users.
10 million.
Yeah.
That is wild.
Think about the sheer scale of that data set. 10 million users, categorized into 3 basic buckets: liberal, moderate, and conservative. The researchers found that the vast majority of these users' friends shared their exact political orientation. So you start with this baseline of homophily. People are naturally sorting themselves into politically homogenous clusters.
And they do it completely voluntarily.
Totally voluntarily. But this is where the algorithmic intervention changes the game entirely. The platform's recommender systems recognize these homogeneous clusters. Because the algorithm's primary directive is engagement, it begins selecting and surfacing information with a bias toward that shared political orientation.
So the traditional human news editor, the person who might have intentionally curated a diverse front page specifically to challenge readers and provide a balanced civic diet, that person has essentially been replaced by a personalized algorithm.
An algorithm that's blindly catering specific information to your feed based purely on what your cluster already engages with.
Right. But the research also points out that this isn't just a passive thing happening to helpless users. There are active mechanics at play here. A 2023 study by Diaz-Ruiz and Nilsson outlines this dynamic as a very distinct 2-step process: seeding and echoing.
That 2-step process is crucial for understanding the modern flow of digital information. Step 1, the seeding, is an active insertion. This is when actors, sometimes malicious, sometimes just highly partisan, intentionally drop misinformation or highly polarizing content into the public sphere. They are basically planting the flag.
And then comes the echoing.
Right. Step 2 is the echoing. This is the organic circulation by everyday people. And they circulate this seeded information because it aligns with their personal beliefs. But it goes deeper than just agreeing with a headline. They share it because it aligns with their identity.
This plays directly into the concept of neo-tribalism. These digital spaces aren't just about sharing objective facts about the world. They are arenas for collective identity construction.
They're building a community.
Exactly. An echo chamber functions a lot like a digital campfire. People gather around it to reinforce who is us and who is them. The controversies become inherently argumentative. Participants are constantly looking to exploit contradictions against perceived opponents. It is tribal warfare disguised as digital discourse.
And that tribal reinforcement naturally leads to severe tunnel vision. As exposure to opposing viewpoints declines, the individual's belief system calcifies. It culminates into a massive, impenetrable confirmation bias regarding a wide variety of subjects, which is a dynamic that actually raises a tough philosophical question about personal responsibility.
What do you mean?
Well, the research suggests that members of an echo chamber are not always fully responsible for their deeply held convictions.
Man, that is a tough pill to swallow, because it implies members aren't entirely at fault for what they believe.
It does. Think about it. If you are raised in a closed loop from childhood, or if your entire geographic community operates within one of these information structures, your baseline reality is dictated by that environment.
Right. You might be utilizing what seem like perfectly rational, acceptable practices for gathering knowledge. asking your neighbors, reading your local paper, listening to community leaders, yet you're still being pushed further into a deceptive worldview because the entire ecosystem is compromised.
Your inputs are fundamentally flawed, even if your processing of those inputs is completely logical.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We constantly use all these terms interchangeably in everyday conversation. We say echo chamber, filter bubble, information silo. But the source material, drawing heavily on the fields of social epistemology and philosophy, makes a massive fundamental distinction between these concepts.
And it's a critical distinction.
Let's start with the filter bubble, a term coined by internet activist Eli Pariser. A filter bubble is a state of intellectual isolation that results purely from personalized searches. It is the mechanical result of an algorithm selectively guessing what you want to see based on your physical location, your past click behavior, and your search history.
So it separates you from information that disagrees with you, but it is the invisible, non-transparent choices of the code doing the separating. It is an algorithmic omission.
Right.
But the text sharply contrasts this with what philosophers call an epistemic bubble. An epistemic bubble is simply an informational network where important sources have been excluded. It is a framework that lacks connectivity to the wider world, and it is often entirely unintentional.
Unintentional isolation.
Yes. If you are in an epistemic bubble, you are just completely unaware that significant counter-evidence or alternative reasoning even exists outside your immediate network.
So it's really just an accident of your circumstances. You haven't heard the other side of the story because the other side of the story literally hasn't reached your town or your social feed.
Precisely. And because it is based on mere omission, epistemic bubbles are structurally fragile. The opposing information hasn't been attacked or vilified. It has merely been left out. Therefore, you can pop an epistemic bubble with relative ease.
Just by showing them the information.
Exactly. All you have to do is expose a member to the information and the sources they have been missing. Once you present the new evidence, the bubble bursts, and their worldview can adjust to accommodate the new facts.
But an echo chamber is a whole different beast. And this distinction completely blew my mind. The research explicitly states that an echo chamber is an epistemic construct where outside voices are actively excluded and systematically discredited.
Active discrediting, that's the key.
Right. It does not suffer from a lack of connectivity like the bubble does. Instead, it relies on a deliberate, orchestrated manipulation of trust. The chamber methodically attacks the credibility of all outside sources, creating a preemptive distrust of anyone who doesn't belong to the in-group.
This raises an important question regarding how we interact with individuals we believe are trapped in these chambers. University of Pennsylvania research cited in the text shows that members of echo chambers become incredibly dependent on the sources inside the chamber, while becoming highly actively resistant to external sources.
So they're armored against outside facts.
Very much so. So unlike the fragile epistemic bubble, echo chambers are incredibly robust. By engineering this preemptive distrust between members and non-members, the insiders become totally insulated from the validity of counter-evidence. Exposing them to new information doesn't pop the chamber, it actually reinforces it.
Because they have been trained to see that outside information as an attack. That is the realization that shifts everything. In an echo chamber, outside voices are actually heard. People in these deep echo chambers aren't cut off from the rest of the internet. They see the opposing viewpoints. They see the counter-arguments.
But they don't trust them.
Exactly. Those viewpoints are instantly, almost reflexively dismissed. The function of the echo chamber isn't necessarily to erode a member's interest in finding the truth. The function is to manipulate their credibility levels. The chamber dictates that fundamentally different establishments and institutions are the only proper sources of authority. They completely change who you trust, not just what you see.
It is a profound psychological manipulation. If your trusted in-group leaders repeatedly tell you that all outside media is corrupt and lying, then when you are inevitably exposed to that outside media, it doesn't challenge your worldview. It serves as confirmation of the narrative that you are under attack by deceitful forces.
It just proves them right in their own minds.
Exactly. The real-world implications of this conceptual difference are staggering. Trying to help someone out of an epistemic bubble requires data. Trying to help someone out of an echo chamber requires rebuilding foundational human trust.
Which perfectly sets up the biggest plot twist of this entire deep dive. With everything we just discussed about the robust psychological architecture of these chambers, you would naturally assume the science is settled. You'd think every major researcher universally agrees that we're all hopelessly trapped in these tribal algorithmic echo chambers, completely insulated from reality.
What's fascinating here is that the empirical findings tell a completely different, highly fragmented story. The science is absolutely not settled.
Not at all.
In fact, clear and distinct findings that uniformly confirm or falsify the deepest concerns about echo chamber effects are simply absent. When different researchers attempt to measure the prevalence of these chambers, they get wildly contradictory results.
Let's look at the evidence that supports the widespread existence of echo chambers first. We talked about that massive 2015 Bakshi study regarding homophily. Well, they also measured a user's potential exposure to cross-cutting content.
Meaning content that presents the exact opposite of the user's own political beliefs.
Right, and through their own networks, the potential exposure to opposing views was staggeringly low. It was only 24% for liberals and 35% for conservatives. That paints a very bleak picture of a highly isolated partisan media diet.
It does, and for a long time that was the dominant narrative. But then we look at the evidence that heavily complicates that picture. The material points to a pivotal 2018 study by Dubois and Blank. They utilized extensive survey data, and their findings suggest that while echo chambers undoubtedly exist, they are not a widespread phenomenon for the general public.
Wait, really?
Really? In fact, they found that the vast majority of people consume news from a wide variety of different sources. According to their data, only about 8% of people consume media with what they categorized as low diversity.
Let's just pause on that number. Only 8%. That completely shatters the popular media narrative that everyone logging onto social media is instantly locked into a blind tunnel of confirmation bias.
It really does.
And the data gets even more complicated when we look at major political events. A 2023 study by Bossetta and colleagues analyzed Facebook comments during the UK Brexit referendum. Now, if ever there was a hyperpolarized environment ripe for absolute echo chamber behavior, you would think it would be the Brexit debate.
Oh, absolutely. It was incredibly divisive.
But they found that 29% of Facebook comments during the referendum were actually cross-cutting expressions. People were actively engaging with, arguing against, and commenting on opposing views. This suggests a crucial difference between what a person quietly reads their passive media diet and how they actively interact in digital spaces.
We also have to consider the findings from a 2022 study by Roosh, which focused specifically on Twitter users. Roche found that the vast majority of Twitter users simply do not exhibit behavior that resembles an echo chamber.
But there's a massive caveat there, right?
A huge caveat that explains a lot of our cultural perception. Roche discovered that a very small, highly concentrated group of active users do exhibit intense echo chamber behavior. And because this small group generates such an overwhelming volume of online activity, they make up a substantial share of the followers for populist politicians.
So they're just incredibly loud.
Exactly. Their sheer volume of relentless output creates the powerful illusion of massive, homogeneous online spaces. The mirage is so convincing that we assume it represents the average user, even though the average user isn't participating in it.
It's the loud minority dominating the visual landscape. And the source material even notes several other studies that completely contradict the echo chamber theory altogether, finding that people frequently and actively share news reports that don't align with their beliefs, or that people using social media are actually exposed to more diverse sources than people who abstain from social media entirely.
It's counterintuitive, but the data is there.
So how do we reconcile this? How can brilliant data scientists and researchers look at the exact same digital landscape and come away with such wildly contradictory conclusions?
The underlying text outlines several severe methodological hurdles in this field of research. First, there is a fundamental lack of standardized definitions. As we discussed with the philosophical distinctions, if one researcher is designing a study to measure filter bubbles based on algorithmic sorting, and another is measuring echo chambers based on active user distrust.
They're measuring completely different things.
Exactly, but they're publishing under the same colloquial labels. Second, the social media platforms themselves are moving targets. They are constantly tweaking their proprietary algorithms. A comprehensive study conducted on Facebook's recommender system in 2015 might be completely mathematically irrelevant by 2018.
Because the underlying code deciding what users see has been fundamentally rewritten.
Yes.
And there is also a massive geographic and political bias in the research itself. The text highlights that the vast majority of these major studies are conducted within the United States.
Mhm.
This heavily limits their global application because the U.S. operates on a deeply entrenched two-party political system.
Which naturally drives a binary sort of polarization.
Right. When you try to seamlessly apply findings about American binary polarization to countries with complex multi-party parliamentary systems, the models often just fall apart. The structural dynamics of polarization are completely different.
So we have a fragmented scientific consensus based on shifting algorithms and mismatched definitions.
So what does this all mean? If the science is fragmented and maybe only 8% of people are truly locked in these low-diversity chambers, should we just brush it off as an overblown panic?
Absolutely not.
Right, because the implications of these fragmented communities, regardless of their total population size, are incredibly severe. And the behavior fostered in these digital spaces bleeds directly into our physical reality.
To understand that bleed, we have to look at a well-documented psychological phenomenon called group polarization. When an online social community becomes intensely fragmented by echo chamber dynamics, like-minded individuals group together and are continuously exposed to arguments pointing in one very specific direction.
And counter-arguments are either ignored or, as we discussed, actively discredited.
Yes. Over time, these consistent insulated interactions severely alter how individuals interpret events and evaluate the basic credibility of the world around them. Cass Sunstein's law of group polarization illustrates this perfectly.
Let's translate that law into a practical scenario. Imagine a group of people who are mildly skeptical of a new local law. They aren't furious, they just have some questions. They join a dedicated online forum to discuss it. Because everyone in that forum shares that initial mild skepticism, the arguments bounce around, gaining momentum and shedding nuance.
It accelerates rapidly.
Exactly. Without the friction of external viewpoints to ground the conversation, the mild skeptics continually validate each other's growing concerns. By the time they log off, that initial group of mild skeptics has radicalized into a group of fervent, absolute opponents. The lack of external viewpoints, combined with the echo of peer agreement, inevitably pushes the group to adopt much more extreme belief sets than any of them would have held as isolated individuals.
And this dynamic erects massive barriers to any sort of critical discourse. Social networking communities are identified in the research as some of the most powerful incubators and reinforcements of rumors. This happens because human beings are wired to inherently trust evidence supplied by our immediate social group much more than we trust information circulating from external traditional news sources.
It's that tribal instinct again.
Furthermore, the digital interface provides a reduction of social fear. People are willing to project extreme views online that they would hesitate to vocalize face-to-face, which allows for even deeper, more rapid engagement with radicalized peer agreement.
There is also this completely fascinating, almost paradoxical insight from a 2021 study by Tokita and their team. They looked at individual behavior within these highly polarized information ecosystems and found that highly reactive individuals, the people who are extremely quick to react to and share socially circulated information, they actually curate politically homogenous environments for themselves on purpose.
They build their own walls.
Right. They do it to avoid the emotional exhaustion of overreacting to news they deem unimportant or offensive. But by curating themselves into this safe corner, their behavior within the echo chamber actually dampens their access to valuable information, even from sources they would normally desire. They isolate themselves to protect their emotional bandwidth, making them far more likely to develop extreme opinions while simultaneously overestimating exactly how well-informed they actually are.
It is a self-inflicted blindness. And as you mentioned, this phenomenon refuses to stay confined to the digital realm. The offline bleed is tangible and measurable. Offline communities, neighborhoods, workplaces, local organizations are increasingly segregated by the political beliefs and cultural views reinforced online.
The source text actually cites a highly revealing 2016 study demonstrating this perfectly.
Right, the Twitter workplace study.
Yeah. Researchers found that Twitter users who felt their audience on the platform agreed with their specific opinions were significantly more willing to speak out on those same issues in their physical workplace.
Their online echo chamber gave them the false, inflated confidence that their specific niche views were the universal, undisputed consensus.
It actively changed their physical, face-to-face behavior at their jobs. It gave them the courage of a crowd that only existed in their phones.
The boundaries between digital reinforcement and physical reality are entirely porous. The echo chamber effect prevents individuals from accurately assessing changes in language, culture, and social norms involving groups outside their own. They lose the ability to accurately read the room, whether that room is a digital forum or a physical town hall meeting.
And we really need to emphasize that this is not a modern problem invented by social media CEOs. This isn't purely a byproduct of the algorithmic age. The source material provides some incredibly detailed historical examples of echo chambers that existed long before Facebook or Twitter algorithms were ever written.
History repeats itself.
Let's look at the news coverage of the McMartin preschool trial in the 1980s. This was a massive, hysteria-driven event. David Shaw, a media critic for the Los Angeles Times, actually won a Pulitzer Prize in 1990 for a devastating series of articles criticizing how the media handled that trial. And he explicitly, repeatedly called the media's behavior an echo chamber.
Shaw's analysis is a perfect historical case study. He meticulously documented how the news media reporting on the McMartin trial largely operated as an insular pack. They fed off one another's reporting, creating what he termed an echo chamber of horrors.
It was journalists just validating other journalists.
Right. The journalistic ecosystem became a closed loop. Despite the horrific charges in the trial never actually being substantiated by hard evidence, journalists collectively abandoned fundamental, rigorous journalistic principles. The pressure to compete drove them to sensationalize the coverage simply to ensure they were the first with the latest shocking allegation.
So the media itself became the chamber.
Amplifying cultural hysteria without any external factual rebuttal slowing them down.
It was an analog algorithm driving engagement through panic. Then you have the 1998 Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. The media frenzy was so intense that Time magazine actually ran a cover story explicitly titled Trial by Leaks. And one of the analytical pieces inside that issue was literally headlined, The Press and the Dress, the anatomy of a salacious leak and how it ricocheted around the walls of the media echo chamber.
Even in 1998, observers recognized that the press was simply bouncing unverified information off of each other, internally reinforcing a narrative before the public even had a chance to digest the facts.
Exactly. Moving from those historical precedents into the modern era, scholars have identified numerous examples of this exact phenomenon, playing out across a wide spectrum of ideologies and digital platforms. And we're going to look at these objectively as structural case studies of the mechanics we've discussed.
For instance, in 2008, researchers Kathleen Hall-Jamieson and Frank Capella published what is considered the first major empirical study concerning these dynamics. They specifically categorized conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh and his broadcast ecosystem as an echo chamber. They mapped how the show insulated its listeners from outside, contradicting information.
It's all about that boundary control.
Right. Similarly, expensive essays and analyses in publications like The New Statesman have heavily linked echo chamber dynamics to the political environment surrounding the United Kingdom's Brexit referendum.
The source material also points to much more niche but highly impactful online communities where these mechanics thrive. The subreddit known as Rincels and various other online incel communities have been extensively studied by sociologists. They are frequently described as textbook echo chambers where extreme insular ideologies against women are constantly reinforced and radicalized through peer agreement.
And we see it in totally different subject areas, too. There is the sprawling network of social media accounts that harbor, circulate, and reinforce the flat Earth theory, creating an entirely alternate epistemic reality for their members.
And it even impacts public health policy. The text notes discussions concerning opioid drugs, specifically the intense online debates over whether they should be considered suitable for long-term pain maintenance, acting as a distinct echo chamber. And this specific chamber was observed to be capable of mobilizing its members to affect real-world drug legislation.
And naturally, the research frequently points to the 2016 United States presidential election as a massive case study. During that cycle, researchers observed that information regarding the campaigns was exchanged primarily among individuals with already similar political and ideological views. Both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were extremely vocal on Twitter, which drew countless opinion leaders, journalists, and everyday voters to the platform to engage.
So you had these two massive hubs of gravity.
Exactly. Studies analyzing the network data showed that the Twitter community supporting both candidates differed significantly in their structural makeup. More importantly, the most highly vocal, hyperactive individuals within those specific groups were responsible for engineering deep, robust echo chambers within those respective communities. Some researchers cited in the text argue that these intense echo chamber effects played a significant part in the ultimate success of Donald Trump in that election by solidifying and mobilizing a highly insulated base.
So we have a landscape where algorithms are supercharging ancient human psychology. We have malicious actors intentionally seeding misinformation to exploit those algorithms. And we have highly vocal, hyperactive minorities building impenetrable digital tribes that create the illusion of massive consensus.
It paints a pretty intense picture.
It really does. Looking at all this, is there any hope? Are we just structurally doomed to a future of relentless, algorithmic neo-tribalism?
The material does outline several deliberate countermeasures, primarily focusing on efforts from major media and technology companies aiming to introduce transparency and diverse viewpoints at an architectural level.
Give us some examples of that.
Well, for instance, Facebook received a significant amount of high-profile attention when it fundamentally modified its trending page several years ago. Originally, the architecture displayed a single news source for any given trending topic. They transitioned to a model that displayed multiple news sources for a single event. It was an intentional algorithmic shift designed to expand the breadth of sources and forcefully expose readers to a variety of viewpoints on the same issue.
There is also some really interesting innovation happening in the startup and independent media space. The article highlights startups like Unfound.news, which are building applications specifically with the foundational mission of encouraging users to voluntarily open up their echo chambers by surfacing differing perspectives on current events.
That voluntary aspect is key.
Right. And BuzzFeed News actually tested a really fascinating beta feature they called Outside Your Bubble. They added a dedicated module to the bottom of their news articles that aggregated and displayed reactions to that specific article from various external platforms, pulling in conversations from Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit.
To show the broader context.
Exactly. The goal was to bring immediate transparency to how different communities were reacting, prevent completely biased, one-sided conversations in their own comment sections, and proactively diversify the viewpoints their readers are exposed to right at the point of consumption.
These are all structural, algorithmic attempts to pop epistemic bubbles, and they are valuable tools. However, if we connect this to the bigger picture, and recall the profound philosophical difference we established between a fragile bubble and a robust chamber, we have to acknowledge that algorithmic tweaks might not be a silver bullet.
Because of the trust issue.
Precisely. If an individual is deeply entrenched in a true echo chamber, where their foundational trust has been successfully manipulated to preemptively dismiss all outside sources as corrupt, deceitful, or hostile, simply showing them a wider variety of news sources at the bottom of an article won't work. The chamber has trained them to view those news sources as further evidence of a broader, coordinated conspiracy against their tribe.
So it could actually backfire.
It could. The structural solutions and diverse news feeds are absolutely necessary for the 92% of people who aren't deeply entrenched, but breaking a true hardened echo chamber requires the incredibly difficult work of rebuilding foundational human-to-human trust.
Wow. We have covered an absolute mountain of ground today. We started out trying to simply define the echo chamber and quickly realized it is a complex psychological architecture, not just a tech buzzword.
Far from it.
We've learned that true echo chambers are less about being passively trapped by invisible algorithms and much more about a deeply manipulated active distrust of outsiders. We explored the shocking reality that the empirical science is heavily fragmented. While a highly vocal, hyperactive minority might live in deep, toxic echo chambers, the average person's media diet is likely far more diverse than they or the media realize.
Which is an important silver lining.
Definitely. We looked at how this isolation bleeds directly into our offline behavior, shaping workplace conversations. And we traced the historical lineage of PAC journalism from the McMartin trial to the digital present.
It is an incredibly complex, multi-layered ecosystem. We are navigating natural human homophily, deeply ingrained confirmation biases, and advanced engagement-driven recommender systems all at the exact same time.
It's a lot to process.
It is. The most vital takeaway for you, the listener, is to actively, ruthlessly evaluate your own personal information environment. Ask yourself, are you simply existing in an epistemic bubble, lacking connection to broader information, which you can fix simply by reading more broadly and seeking out different sources? Or are you part of an echo chamber where you have been conditioned to actively distrust and dismiss outside information before you even evaluate its merits?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It is a massive amount of information to process, but understanding these invisible mechanisms is the absolute first step to truly taking control of your own media diet, protecting your intellectual independence, and shaping your own worldview.
I will leave you with this final thought, building precisely on the mechanics of trust we have discussed today. If a true echo chamber functions primarily by manipulating your trust so that you preemptively dismiss outside voices without a second thought, ask yourself this. Who is a voice you instantly discredit before they even finish their sentence? And more importantly, who taught you to discredit them?
That is a question worth sitting with. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and stay curious. I want you to just take a second and picture a monastery.
Right, just get that image in your head.
Yeah, because for most of us, that conjures a very specific, almost cinematic aesthetic. You're likely imagining this imposing, silent stone fortress.
Maybe clinging to a remote cliffside somewhere.
Exactly. Or buried deep in an inaccessible forest, right? Inside those thick walls, you picture solitary figures in these heavy, unadorned robes moving slowly through cloistered walkways.
Heads bowed.
Heads bowed, completely silent, just entirely severed from the economic and political machinery of the outside world.
It's an image that is really defined by absence.
Absence of noise, absence of wealth.
Absence of societal engagement. Yeah.
But looking at the historical record, that isolated, silent building you are picturing was, more often than not, an ancient version of a bustling, self-sustaining metropolis.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. We are talking about massive complexes commanding vast agricultural operations.
Pioneering complex hospital systems.
Yes. And operating commercial-scale breweries. Even serving as the epicenter for intense, high-stakes political drama.
The contrast between that cultural myth and the historical reality is just, it's stark.
So stark. And that structural evolution is exactly what we're going to be exploring today. Welcome to your custom-tailored deep dive.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack a comprehensive examination of monasteries, exploring how the core concept of, well, living alone actually birthed some of the most formidable communal engines of civilization.
Education, too.
Oh, absolutely. And even a few historical murder mysteries, which we'll get to later.
Can't forget the murder mysteries.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this, because to truly understand these institutions, we have to strip away the romanticized stereotype of monastics just sitting in an endless passive contemplation.
Right, and to begin deconstructing that stereotype, we really have to examine the foundational blueprint of the monastery itself, which immediately presents us with a striking linguistic contradiction.
Oh, the etymology.
Yes. The English word monastery actually derives from the Greek word monastorion.
Okay.
And that term is anchored by the root monos, which translates literally and unambiguously to alone.
So the etymology alone highlights the paradox we're talking about.
Exactly.
We use a word that fundamentally means alone to describe sprawling complexes where hundreds and historically thousands of individuals lived in super dense proximity.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that evolution from the purely solitary hermit, which was the original uncompromising form of the early Christian monastic, to the staggering self-sustaining estates of the medieval period.
It wasn't just a sudden jump, though.
No, not at all. But the architectural layout of a typical developed monastic complex, it extended way beyond a simple chapel or a space for worship.
It became a highly engineered, closed-loop ecosystem.
Ecosystem is an apt descriptor, yeah.
If you examine the infrastructure of these complexes, they resemble, well, basically a medieval iteration of a massive corporate campus.
Or an independent municipality.
Exactly. Beyond the dormitories and the cloisters designed for contemplation, you have the refectories.
The communal dining halls.
Right. And extensive libraries, balnearies for bathing, and really sophisticated infirmaries.
And depending on the geographic and economic context, they operated with the industrial capacity of many cities.
Totally. We see dedicated barns, forges for metalworking.
Hospices to manage the flow of pilgrims and travelers.
Schools, and as I mentioned earlier, highly profitable breweries. The whole design was predicated entirely on achieving absolute self-sufficiency.
And this architectural pursuit of the self-sufficient spiritual community, it's a genuinely global phenomenon.
It's not just a European thing.
Not at all. The specific terminology shifts to reflect the geographic and theological context, obviously, but the core structural ambition remains remarkably consistent.
Like in the Buddhist tradition, right?
Yes. Within Buddhism, the generic nomenclature is often vihara. If you analyze the Tibetan landscape, these structures are termed gompas.
Whereas in Southeast Asian regions like Thailand or Cambodia, they are designated as wats.
Exactly.
And in the Western Christian tradition, the vocabulary expands to include abbeys, priories, or hermitages.
Concurrently, within Hinduism, the equivalent structural and functional entities are established as mathas, or ashrams.
So the impulse is universal even if the names change.
Right, and to truly conceptualize how far this institutional reality drifted from that Greek root word monos, we can look at specific historical benchmarks.
Oh, like the Dripun Monastery.
The Drepung Monastery in Tibet is a prime example of this extreme scale.
The demographics of Drepung are they're difficult to reconcile with the concept of a spiritual retreat.
Very difficult.
Because prior to the Chinese invasion in the 1950s, that single monastery housed a population of approximately 10,000 monks.
10,000? It's a staggering demographic concentration.
Right. But at that scale, 10,000 people living within a single complex, does it even function as a monastic retreat anymore?
Or does it inevitably morph into a secular municipality with a religious veneer?
Exactly. Because the sheer logistical burden of managing sanitation, securing supply chains for food, and maintaining internal governance for 10,000 people.
It requires a massive bureaucracy.
The bureaucracy that seems completely antithetical to ascetic withdrawal.
Even today, the relocated iteration of Drepung in India manages a population of around 8,000. It is still a massive administrative undertaking.
The line between spiritual community and civic administration undeniably blurs at that magnitude, which logically leads us to the question of origins.
Right, the why and the how.
Yeah. How did the disparate practices of individual spiritual withdrawal coalesce into these highly organized, densely populated communal settlements?
The historical drivers point to catalysts that are surprisingly pragmatic.
And in some cases, entirely environmental.
Yes. The shift toward communal living was not always the result of some grand theological master plan. Often it was simply dictated by the weather.
Which is so interesting. The meteorological origins of Buddhist monasticism are a perfect example of this. If we look at the genesis of Buddhism around the 4th century BCE, the early monks and nuns were wandering mendicants.
Their practice relied on constant travel and reliance on alms.
Right. However, the South Asian climate presented an unavoidable logistical barrier.
The wet season.
The monsoons.
Yeah, the Vasa retreat.
Exactly, the Vasa. The Vasa dictates a roughly 3-month period, typically commencing in mid-July, characterized by intense monsoons.
Continual travel during this window exposed these mendicants to severe physical risk.
Getting stranded, getting sick.
Right. But beyond simple self-preservation, there was a deeply rooted theological mandate for ceasing travel.
Oh, because of the new plant growth.
Exactly. They were obligated to remain stationary to avoid trampling the new plant growth and the proliferation of insects that emerged during the rains.
It is a direct operationalization of the core principle of non-harming.
Ahimsa.
Ahimsa, yes. But the practical consequence of this theological mandate was that large transient populations of mendicants required static infrastructure for a quarter of the year.
Right. You can't just have hundreds of people standing in a field for 3 months.
Right. So wealthy lay supporters recognized this recurring logistical bottleneck.
And they stepped in.
They did. They began donating enclosed parks and structural pavilions specifically for the Sangha to utilize during the Vasa.
And human sociology essentially takes over from there.
Yeah. You have a secure property, reliable infrastructure, and a community confined together for 3 months. Gradually, the custom calcified.
It became permanent.
These properties, which were held in common by the community, transitioned from temporary shelters into permanent, year-round Cenobitic monasticism.
The shared experience of waiting out the rain forged the permanent Buddhist monastery.
It's amazing. It highlights a brilliant environmental adaptation, shaping the entire trajectory of a global religion.
It really does. Now, if we pivot to the origins of Christian monasticism, the environmental pressures were distinct, but the evolutionary trajectory from solitary asceticism to organized communalism is equally revealing.
The harshness of the Egyptian desert served as the crucible for early Christian monasticism, right?
Yes. Figures like Anthony the Great represent the absolute extreme of the monos ideal.
He was a radical hermit.
Radical is the word. He retreated into deep desert caves, actively minimizing any intersection with human society.
Just completely isolating himself.
Yet, maintaining absolute, indefinite psychological and physical isolation is an incredibly precarious undertaking.
I can imagine. The human mind is rarely equipped to sustain pure solitude without severe degradation.
Right. And recognizing this vulnerability, the historical record introduces a pivotal transitional architect, a figure named Amonas.
Amonas.
He observed the psychological attrition among the Desert Fathers and engineered a hybrid model.
A sort of middle ground.
Exactly. Under his system, ascetics maintained their solitary existence, but they were clustered in close enough proximity to offer mutual logistical and psychological support.
Kind of like living in the same apartment building but never hanging out except when there's an emergency.
Basically. And eventually, this led to instituting mandatory communal gatherings on Sundays.
It is the invention of a spiritual neighborhood.
That's a great way to put it.
You retain the autonomy of your individual cave, but you have a localized safety net if the physical elements or psychological strain become overwhelming.
But the true architectural leap to the centralized, highly regulated monastery required a different kind of organizational genius.
And one drawn from a completely unexpected sector.
The military.
Yes, Pachomius the Great. He's the figure credited with formalizing Christian Cenobitic monasticism.
The system where renunciates live, labor, and worship under a single roof, bound by a uniform set of rules.
And the methodology Pachomius utilized is fascinating because his background wasn't entirely rooted in theological study.
No, prior to his ascetic withdrawal, Pachomius actually served as a conscripted soldier in the Roman army.
Which is such a wild pivot. But it represents this profound cross-pollination of institutional frameworks.
He took the rigid, highly efficient structures of the Roman military barracks and directly transposed them onto the disorganized fervor of desert asceticism.
Applying military hierarchy to a spiritual pursuit initially seems counterintuitive. I mean, you are essentially trading internal, unguided spiritual discovery for external, enforced compliance.
It does seem contradictory. But if you have hundreds or thousands of zealous ascetics wandering the desert without infrastructure,
the result is administrative chaos.
Complete chaos. Pachomius recognized that scaling asceticism required the mechanisms of a military platoon.
So he instituted rigid daily schedules.
Standardized uniforms.
A strict chain of command, centralized housing. He essentially weaponized the operational efficiency of the Roman legion to support a massive population of spiritual seekers.
And the efficacy of that structural transposition was immediate and staggering.
The Nitria region of the Egyptian desert quickly transformed into what was known as the Holy City.
Historical estimates suggest that under these highly organized models, upwards of 50,000 monks were sustained in that desert environment at any given time.
50,000 people in the desert. Sustaining 50,000 individuals in an unforgiving environment proves that the underlying logistical framework was nearly flawless.
It had to be.
But managing a population of that density requires an uncompromising regulatory environment. Living inside one of these hyper-organized communal structures meant submitting to a daily reality of absolute, unwavering discipline.
Which brings us to the operational reality of the Western Christian schedule.
Heavily influenced by the rule of St. Benedict.
Yes. It was an existence defined by rigorous self-abnegation where the concept of labor and the concept of prayer were inextricably fused.
And the schedule was utterly relentless. It was designed to systematically break down individual autonomy. A monk's entire existence was subjugated to the rhythm of the divine office.
We're looking at a continuous cycle of communal prayer. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, daily mass, sext, none, vespers, and compline.
The psychological impact of that schedule cannot be overstated, particularly regarding sleep architecture.
Right, because matins required the community to rise in the deep hours of the night.
Fundamentally fragmenting their sleep cycle.
Every single night.
Their entire consciousness was tethered to communal worship, with strictly portioned intervals allocated for manual labor, agricultural management, or scriptorium work.
And the division of labor was heavily systematized.
Yeah, those with scholastic aptitude were assigned to the scriptorium, engaging in the grueling, freezing work of hand-copying manuscripts.
A labor-intensive process that is directly responsible for the preservation of countless historical texts.
And those lacking scholastic inclination, they were deployed into the physical machinery of the complex.
Working the forges, managing the livestock, maintaining the agricultural yield required to keep the community solvent.
And the discipline extended heavily into their biological needs, specifically the refectory.
The communal dining space.
Yeah, the refectory offers a profound window into the behavioral constraints of these institutions. The primary meal, typically occurring around noon, was an exercise in extreme austerity.
The dietary baseline was highly restricted. We're looking at staples like poached fish, dark bread, root vegetables.
Eggs, cheese, boiled oats.
But the psychological weight of the meal wasn't the food, it was the acoustic environment.
A mandate of absolute silence was enforced throughout the entire service. The only permitted sound was the voice of a single monk reading scripture or theological texts from an elevated pulpit.
Which introduces a complex logistical hurdle.
Exactly. How does a large group of people efficiently manage the mechanics of a shared meal, passing salt, requesting bread, communicating basic physical needs, while under the threat of severe penalization for uttering a single syllable?
Well, they bypassed the vocal cords entirely.
They developed a localized, complex system of sign language.
Yes.
The imagery of this is incredible. You have a cavernous stone dining hall, hundreds of men eating austere meals in total acoustic silence while the scriptures echo off the walls.
And simultaneously, underneath that religious veneer, there is a furious, silent exchange of hand gestures just to facilitate the distribution of a block of cheese.
It perfectly illustrates how human pragmatism always finds a way to navigate rigid, top-down constraints.
It is a brilliant adaptation to a highly constrained environment. And speaking of physical constraints, we really must analyze the thermal realities of these complexes.
Oh, the calefactory.
Specifically the role of the calefactory, yes.
The warming house. The thermal dynamics of medieval monasticism strip away any lingering romanticism you might have left.
In the sprawling, uninsulated stone architecture of a standard medieval monastery, the calefactory was frequently the singular room in the entire complex where a fire was permitted to be lit.
Consider the physical toll of that environment during a European winter.
It's brutal.
You are inhabiting a massive stone structure. You have been awake since 2 a.m. for the night offices. You have been engaged in either physical labor in frozen fields or sitting rigidly in an unheated scriptorium.
And your caloric intake is minimal.
Minimal. The calefactory becomes the singular epicenter of survival,
Dozens of freezing individuals huddled around one hearth.
likely utilizing those complex hand gestures to communicate their physical misery.
Probably. It highlights the brutal, uncompromising physiological reality of ascetic life.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is precisely this brutal internal discipline and centralized labor force that positioned monasteries as the foundational pillars of early societal infrastructure.
Absolutely. They operated as highly resilient hubs capable of absorbing external shocks that would otherwise shatter medieval society.
Their operational portfolio is essentially the blueprint for the modern civic state.
When catastrophic plagues decimated regional populations, the strict internal organization of the monasteries allowed them to mobilize as frontline healthcare providers.
Managing the sick and maintaining agricultural output when secular supply chains collapsed.
They were the premier hospitals and emergency response networks of the medieval era.
And their capacity for systematic preservation and innovation catalyzed the cultural and intellectual development of Europe, too.
Like the standardization of musical notation.
Right. That's heavily attributed to a monk named Notker of St. Gall.
Because these monasteries were not isolated islands, but nodes in a vast, interconnected continental network.
Innovations like standardized musical notation or agricultural techniques could be rapidly transmitted across thousands of miles. They functioned as an analog internet.
That's a great analogy. Furthermore, the structural DNA of the modern university system was synthesized directly within the monastic framework.
Because these institutions monopolized literacy and possessed extensive libraries, they naturally became gravitational centers for intellectual pursuit.
Lay people and scholars began traveling to them not merely for religious absolution, but for academic engagement.
And the architectural legacy of this transition is still visible today.
Think about the spatial hierarchy of the monastic refectory,
where the abbot and distinguished guests occupied an elevated high table, while the general community sat perpendicular in strict order of seniority.
That layout was directly absorbed by early academic institutions.
If you observe the dining halls of Oxford or Cambridge today, you are looking at a replicated monastic refectory. The entire modern academic apparatus is built on an architectural and operational foundation laid by ascetics.
The embedded legacy is undeniable. However, analyzing the global expansion of monasticism reveals that this framework was highly malleable.
It wasn't one size fits all.
No. As the concept permeated different geographic, economic, and cultural landscapes, it underwent significant structural mutations.
Frequently diverging sharply from the original rigid ascetic ideals of Pachomius or Benedict.
The structural variations are deeply revealing. Analyzing the Eastern Orthodox Church demonstrates a completely different approach to organization.
Unlike the Roman Catholic system, which compartmentalized into distinct branded orders, your Franciscans, your Dominicans, your Benedictines.
The Eastern Orthodox tradition maintains a unified monastic identity that operates on a sliding scale of intensity.
They utilize a tripartite structural model,
At one extreme, you have the hermit.
preserving the foundational isolation of Anthony the Great, pursuing extreme individual asceticism.
And at the opposite pole is the cenobium, the highly regimented communal structure where labor, resources, and worship are entirely collectivized.
Now, the psychological rationale behind the cenobium is articulated through a remarkably perceptive analogy in our sources.
The smooth rocks analogy.
Yes, participating in cenobitic life is likened to a collection of rocks with sharp, irregular edges being tossed together into a confined space.
The perpetual friction of communal living, the unavoidable personality conflicts, the subjugation of the individual ego to the collective will, the daily grind of shared labor, it acts as a polishing mechanism.
The friction slowly grinds away the sharp edges of the ego, resulting in a community of smooth, polished stones.
It is an incredibly accurate psychological assessment of the abrasive nature of intense communal living.
It demonstrates a very sophisticated understanding of group dynamics as a tool for ego suppression.
And situated right between the absolute isolation of the hermit and the total collectivization of the cenobium, the Orthodox tradition deployed the skete.
The skete operates as the pragmatic middle ground. It is essentially a micro-community.
Typically consisting of a single elder and a minimal number of disciples.
They maintain individual autonomy for prayer and labor throughout the majority of the week, but consolidate on Sundays and feast days.
It provides the psychological safety net Amona's envisioned without the bureaucratic crushing weight of the massive cenobium.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the evolution of monasticism wasn't purely a theological refinement.
Far from it.
In many regions, the pursuit of ascetic poverty inverted entirely, transforming monasteries into formidable economic cartels that fundamentally rewrote their own operating rules.
The accumulation and management of vast wealth by institutions theoretically dedicated to poverty is a recurring historical theme.
Despite unambiguous theological mandates, such as the Buddhist Vinaya Code, which strictly prohibited the handling of currency or the accumulation of personal wealth.
The practical reality of sustained land donations inevitably transformed many monasteries into massive economic powerhouses, acting as feudal lords.
The economic mechanics of this shift are just fascinating.
Yeah.
In the context of Chinese Buddhism, the monastery ceased to be merely a spiritual retreat and became the primary economic engine of the region.
Peasant populations were utilized to cultivate monastic-owned land,
Paying a fixed percentage of their agricultural yield directly to the resident monastic community.
functioning exactly as a secular taxation system under a feudal lord.
The monks were the landlords, and the spiritual complex was essentially a vast agricultural holding company.
And the administrative pressure of managing massive generational wealth inevitably fractures the traditional mandates of celibacy and non-attachment.
Right, if an institution controls a vast property portfolio, the imperative to maintain control of those assets often overrides theological constraints.
The historical record shows that in regions like Sri Lanka and within Tibetan Buddhism, the ownership and administrative control of a monastery could become vested entirely within a single individual.
Which creates an immediate succession crisis for a celibate monk.
Naturally.
If you control a highly profitable estate and lack direct biological heirs, how do you retain the wealth within the family unit?
The systemic workaround was nepotism.
Control of the monastery and its accompanying wealth was routinely passed to a nephew who was subsequently ordained.
It transformed the spiritual institution into a closed-loop familial inheritance system.
And in Japan, the civil authorities eventually formalized this deviation by legally permitting Buddhist clerics to marry.
Consequently, the position of head abbot at major temples transitioned into a strictly hereditary title.
Passed directly from father to son across generations.
It completely dismantles the conventional definition of a renunciate monk.
It is a profound demonstration of institutional adaptability. The theological ideals inevitably mold to the economic and legal contours of their host environment.
We observe a similar magnitude of institutional pivoting within the Christian tradition, particularly in the shockwave following the Protestant Reformation.
The Reformation completely rewired the geopolitical and theological map of Europe.
And the monasteries had to adapt or face dissolution.
In newly established Lutheran territories, Certain monastic institutions didn't simply close. They executed a theological pivot.
They adopted the Lutheran doctrine and continued their communal operations under a drastically revised theological framework.
And the trajectory of Protestant communal living continued to generate novel structural experiments well into the modern era.
By the mid-20th century, specifically the 1960s, we see the emergence of highly unconventional monastic iterations.
The 1960s produced experiments that directly challenged centuries of rigid segregation. We see the formation of intentional communities operating on a monastic chassis, but with revolutionary modifications.
They were co-educational,
Housing men and women within the same complex.
and they explicitly permitted marriage and child-rearing while maintaining a communal economic and spiritual structure.
And the drive to synthesize monastic structures with contemporary economic realities hasn't slowed down. Examining modern monastic operations reveals adaptations that sound almost satirical until you realize the underlying pragmatism.
Right. To maintain economic solvency in the 21st century, modern monasteries have expanded their revenue streams far beyond agriculture and brewing.
It is now entirely plausible to engage a cloistered monastic community for comprehensive IT support
Software development.
and complex accounting services.
The juxtaposition is brilliant.
You have individuals bound by ancient vows of stability and obedience managing corporate tax ledgers and server infrastructure.
But it perfectly aligns with the original mandate of self-sufficiency.
If the medieval economy demanded illuminated manuscripts and agricultural yields to survive, the modern digital economy demands data management and financial auditing.
The economic vehicle has updated, but the underlying drive for institutional independence remains exactly the same.
It highlights the extreme resilience of the model.
And it is precisely this tension, the stark boundary between the secretive, regulated internal world of the monastery and the curiosity of the secular society surrounding it, that has made these institutions a permanent fixture of fascination and anxiety within popular culture.
The secular society has always viewed the closed doors of a monastery with a potent mixture of deep reverence and intense suspicion.
The architectural reality of a walled-off complex operating under autonomous, unquestionable authority is essentially a blank canvas for societal projection.
If you isolate a population and implement a rigid behavioral code, the outside world will inevitably assume that explosive secrets are being harbored within.
This psychological dynamic is vividly mapped across centuries of literature.
The literary record serves as an excellent barometer for how society perceives the monastic threat or utility.
Matthew Lewis's 1796 Gothic masterpiece, The Monk, perfectly encapsulates the era's anxiety regarding unchecked religious authority.
Set against the backdrop of the Spanish Inquisition, it utilizes the fictionalized monastery, not as a sanctuary, but as an impenetrable fortress, shielding profound moral corruption and hypocrisy.
It leverages the ultimate Gothic trope, the institution demanding absolute external purity while festering with internal depravity.
Conversely, Jane Austen approaches the institution from a deeply pragmatic socioeconomic angle in Northanger Abbey.
Austen weaponizes the setting of a repurposed abbey to highlight a much darker historical utility of convents.
For centuries, these institutions frequently functioned not as destinations for genuine spiritual calling, but as convenient socioeconomic dumping grounds.
If an aristocratic family possessed surplus daughters,
Or if a woman proved unwilling or unable to secure a politically advantageous marriage.
the convent served as a socially acceptable mechanism for removing her from the economic chessboard.
It was in many cases a punitive exile cloaked in religious piety.
Austen highlights the transactional nature of these institutions within patriarchal structures.
Moving into the realm of profound psychological and philosophical analysis, Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov offers an unparalleled dissection of the power dynamics inherent in Orthodox monasticism.
Dostoevsky doesn't rely on Gothic tropes.
No, he dissects the very real, very intense psychological machinery of the institution.
He zeroed in on the concept of elderhood, the immense, almost absolute spiritual authority concentrated in a single charismatic elder.
Drawing heavily from authentic historical texts regarding the elders of Oftina, he explores the volatile mix of intense devotion, the potential for psychological manipulation, and the brutal internal politics that erupt when human ego intersects with perceived divine authority.
But the pinnacle of integrating intense theological debate with the pressurized environment of the monastery is undoubtedly Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose.
Published in 1980, Eco engineered the ultimate intellectual thriller.
He sets the narrative in a 14th century Italian abbey, utilizing a very real, incredibly dense historical theological debate.
The bitter conflict between the Franciscan and Dominican orders regarding the absolute poverty of Christ.
And uses it as the foundational motive for a labyrinthine murder mystery.
This raises an important question structurally speaking. Why does the monastery serve as such an unparalleled environment for a thriller?
Because it is the quintessential locked room environment, but magnified to the scale of a community.
You have a completely sealed ecosystem with a finite, documented population.
You have a labyrinthine architectural layout, hidden libraries, restricted zones, subterranean passages.
But most importantly, you have an environment where behavior is so heavily regimented, where the daily schedule is dictated down to the minute, that any deviation is catastrophic.
In a secular city, an anomaly goes unnoticed.
In a monastery where everyone is expected to be at exactly the same place at exactly the same time, an empty seat in the choir is a massive, highly visible structural failure.
The rigidity of the rules amplifies the drama of the transgression.
The environment acts as a pressure cooker for human behavior.
And this fundamental human drive to forge these intense, highly disciplined enclaves is so pervasive that it actively emerges even within theological systems designed to suppress it.
The historical development within Islam presents a striking paradox in this regard.
The dynamic within Islam is fascinating because the foundational texts are explicitly anti-monastic.
The Quran directly addresses the concept of monasticism and dismisses it as a human invention, an unauthorized deviation from the intended path.
The theological framework of Islam emphasizes integration with society, not withdrawal from it.
Yet, the psychological impulse for ascetic withdrawal and mystical pursuit cannot be legislated out of existence.
While Islam actively discouraged the massive cenobitic complexes seen in Buddhism or Christianity, the human desire for a dedicated ascetic pathway to the divine manifested through the emergence of Sufism.
Muslim mystics, desiring a more direct experiential union with Allah, adopted rigorous ascetic practices that closely mirrored the renunciate lifestyles of other traditions.
A primary physical marker of this withdrawal was the adoption of an abrasive, coarse, woolen garment.
And the linguistic origin of the movement is tied directly to that garment. The Arabic word for that coarse wool is suf.
Precisely. The term Sufism derives from Sufi, identifying the practitioner who wears the wool as a symbol of their rejection of worldly comfort.
They may not have constructed the sprawling, self-contained cities of Pachomius,
but they successfully engineered a parallel monastic reality.
a deeply committed network of practitioners prioritizing asceticism, mystic union, and internal discipline, operating within a religion that structurally rejected the monastic premise.
It proves that you can dismantle the physical architecture and outlaw the administrative institution, but you cannot eradicate the underlying human impulse.
There is a deeply embedded psychological mechanism that occasionally demands we sever ties with the noise of the prevailing culture, adopt a posture of extreme discipline, whether that means a hair shirt or a coarse woolen robe, and focus entirely on a singular internal or intellectual objective.
That resilient, adaptable human impulse is the central thread connecting everything we have analyzed today.
And the scope of that analysis is incredible. We have tracked this concept from the rain-soaked pavilions of early Buddhist India, where environmental pragmatism forced wanderers to settle,
To the brutal Egyptian deserts where the organizational genius of the Roman military was repurposed to manage tens of thousands of ascetic hermits.
we have examined how these isolated outposts evolved into the foundational pillars of medieval civilization,
Operating as frontline hospitals during plagues.
preserving global knowledge
Right.
and laying the exact architectural and administrative blueprints for the modern university system.
We've seen the economic realities warp these institutions into vast, hereditary, feudal estates in Tibet and Japan.
And track their adaptation straight into the 21st century, where cloistered monks are offering corporate IT and accounting services.
The historical reality proves that the monastery is not a static, silent monument to the past.
It is an incredibly dynamic, aggressively adaptable, and highly resilient framework for human organization.
So the next time the word monastery is invoked, do not just envision a passive, quiet stone building.
Recognize it as a highly sophisticated, historically vital engine of human civilization.
And applying this to our contemporary reality, the core utility of the monastic impulse feels more urgent than ever.
We are navigating an era defined by aggressive digital noise, unrelenting connectivity, and severe information overload.
The fact that you are engaging with this deep dive is an exercise in that exact impulse.
Curating your inputs, shutting out the peripheral noise, and focusing intently on a singular, complex narrative.
The fundamental drive to withdraw from the mainstream current, to establish an intentional boundary, and to cultivate focus has never been more relevant.
The modern pursuit of deep work or digital minimalism is simply a secularized manifestation of the same psychological imperative that drove early ascetics into the Nitrian desert.
So what does this all mean for the architecture of our modern lives?
I want to leave you with one final structural provocation, drawing on a very specific, almost contradictory system utilized in Greece and Cyprus under Ottoman rule.
We have heavily contrasted the absolute isolation of the hermit with the total collectivization of the cenobium.
But there is a hybrid model known as the idiorhythmic lifestyle.
It is a fascinating administrative compromise that challenges our binary understanding of community.
Under the idiorhythmic framework, practitioners co-locate within a shared architectural complex, but the economic and operational integration stops there.
They retain absolute individual ownership of their assets.
They dictate their own schedules, and critically, there is zero obligation to labor for the common economic good of the complex.
They share the physical geography, but maintain total individual autonomy.
It is the privatization of the cenobitic space.
Exactly.
So I want you to consider the mechanics of that arrangement. Is a 15th century idiorhythmic monastery fundamentally any different from the operational model of a modern premium co-working space?
Or the economic reality of a high-density urban apartment shared by roommates who aggressively divide the utility bills, label their individual groceries, and operate on entirely separate schedules.
You are sharing the overhead costs of the infrastructure, but you are entirely insulated within your own economic and operational silo.
It suggests that the boundary separating ancient, specialized ascetic organization from the fragmented reality of modern urban living is largely an illusion.
Think about the structural parallels the next time you are sharing a table at a crowded coffee shop, surrounded by people, yet entirely isolated inside your noise-canceling headphones. Until next time, keep diving deep.